Well, hello and welcome. I'm Mark Turner, the External Relations Director of SRM 360, and thanks for joining us on this discussion of climate change and coral reefs and how weather, solar geoengineering might play a part in affecting the future of corals. Our goal at SRM 360 is to support an informed discussion about sunlight reflection methods, also known as solar radiation modification or SRM. And that includes exploring the context in which these ideas are being considered. We, SRM 360, don't take a position on whether SRM should ever be deployed or not. However, we do support its research and broad-based discussions on the best way forwards. So thank you again for coming. I hope you enjoy the discussion. Dave Levitan, who's here with us, our new lead writer and editor, and who has years of climate reporting experience, will be fielding questions from the audience and posing them to various members of the panel. So please do ask your questions in the Q&A chat, which you can see at the bottom of your screen as we go along. We'll direct those questions to panelists both halfway through the talk and again at the end of the discussion. Without further ado, I'll now turn over to Pete Irvin, our editorial director.
And here we are. So coral reefs are really important. They support biodiversity, they underpin fisheries and coastal protection, and they sustain community livelihoods. By some estimates, around 1 billion people around the world rely on them in various ways. With temperature rising, many reef systems are being pushed towards collapse, with potential tipping points imminent. Rising ocean temperatures and increasingly frequent marine heat waves are triggering mass bleaching events, as you can see here in this coral. And this is happening faster than reefs can recover in some places. And alongside this, we have ocean acidification, which is weakening coral skeletons and slowing growth. Ocean surface temperatures have risen by around 0.5 degrees Celsius since the 1980s. You can see here a distribution of corals across the tropics. The oceans are more acidic than they have been for millions of years. As a result, global coral coverage has declined by about 50% since the 1950s. And if current trends continue, reef-building corals may not make it through the century. In this panel discussion, we will look into the threats corals face and what might be done to protect them, including the potential of various types of solar geoengineering. So, to our panelists, joining us to talk through these issues today are 3 experts. We have Ken Caldeira, visiting scholar at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability and a senior scientist at Gates Ventures, whose research includes ocean acidification, energy systems, and solar geoengineering. We also have Daniel Harrison, associate professor at the National Marine Science Center, the Southern Cross University, whose current work focuses on engineering interventions in marine systems, including eco-engineering and geoengineering. And we have Cheryl Harrison, assistant professor at Louisiana State University and Earth System Model Coordinator for FISHMIP, that is the, I presume, Fisheries Modeling Intercomparison Project, with expertise in ocean modeling, marine ecology, fisheries, nuclear winters, and climate change. Before I turn to our panelists, I'd like to open with a question to our audience. So we should have a poll popping up, and it asks, are current climate change mitigation strategies enough to prevent widespread collapse of coral reef systems? You might not know, but give it a go. Yes, definitely, likely yes, likely not, or no, definitely not. I'll wait a few seconds here for the answers to start coming in. And I'll let Kerry decide when a significant fraction of you have done so. And here we are. Are we going to see some results? Oh my goodness. It looks like current climate change strategies are not sufficient. 2/3 of you reckon they're not sufficient. So the prospects seem pretty pessimistic there. So, turning to Daniel first, I've got a very brief intro and overview here, but can you explain the importance of coral reefs to marine biodiversity and human societies and what impacts we might see if they were lost?
I think you did give a good introduction, Pete. The figure that's often quoted that coral reefs support 25% of all marine life at some stage of their development, at some stage of their life cycle, but cover less than 1% of the oceans, sums it up pretty well for biodiversity, I think. If you really think about that for a moment, that's a quarter of everything living in the ocean has some reliance on coral reefs. So the loss of them is going to be quite devastating for life in the oceans as we know it. Then on top of that, there's enormous cultural importance of coral reefs to the indigenous peoples and to the local communities that live in those areas of coral reefs. It's really quite central to their identity in a lot of cases. And even in the case of all of Australia, I think all of Australia considers the Great Barrier Reef as quite central to our sort of cultural identity. And then, of course, there's a whole slew of other benefits. There's economic, tourism, income, fisheries, commercial fisheries, recreational fisheries, coastal protection. There's really quite large areas of agricultural and other land that is protected by coral reefs, and that land has developed in this delta behind coral reefs with the protection from waves. So it's a quite a different kind of coastline that you find behind coral reefs that's often very important for agriculture and other purposes that would be very changed with the loss of coral reefs. So quite a wide range of factors.
What is it about the corals that make them so important? Is it kind of the physicality of them, that the kind of the structure?
I think it's different things for different aspects. Certainly, the biodiversity, the number of life forms that make their home in coral reefs is just staggering. You know, they're often called the rainforests of the ocean. In terms of sort of fish habitat and other marine life forms, there, the structural complexity of the way corals grow, and they make all these little crevices and cracks and things for fish and invertebrates and various animals to hide within. And that structural complexity and the fact that they accrete reefs, so they build these huge geological structures over geological timeframes, is what becomes very important for sort of the coastal protection aspect. So it's different things for different benefits that we derive from them, or that the world does.
Thanks. So Cheryl, in terms of fisheries specifically, how important are coral reefs, and how have things changed in that space around the world?
Sorry, I have to unmute myself. I forgot. So, as Daniel said, we think 25% of all marine life uses coral reefs at some part of their life stage, and that includes fish, of course. And it's often quoted that, there are many fisheries that are specifically coral dependent, such as grouper, which is a large commercial fisheries, for example, in the Southeast US and in the Caribbean. And in the Gulf of Mexico. And in the US, coral reefs support about 200 million in recreational and commercial fisheries, and about half of all federally managed species depend on coral reefs here in the United States. And we are not a coral hotspot like the Coral Triangle, north of Australia, Indonesia. So it's much more important there. And when coral reefs, is that enough? You want me to expand more?
Oh, please do. Please.
Okay. So coral reefs have already been very hard hit by warming ocean temperatures. So here in the US, in 2023, there was a large marine heat wave that hit Florida, the Florida Keys, the Dry Tortugas. And it reached a new degree heating week, which is a metric for coral bleaching of how hot it is for how long, that had been unseen. And it was way outside any range that had ever been witnessed there. And this made the coral colonies in that region functionally extinct. So 100% of the corals died, and it's not clear that they're coming back. So we're already seeing these really big impacts. And it's getting worse, and more repeated, more frequent, stronger heat waves that we expect in the future. It makes it likely that corals will be unable to recover between disturbances. So they're adapted for recovery from hurricanes and different disruptions. But if they're outside of their physiology, imagine like if you're out in the cold for too long, you don't function anymore. So corals are the canary in the coal mine for global warming driven extinction.
Yeah, thank you. So Cheryl mentioned briefly there some of the impacts of climate change. We'll get into a bit more detail in a second. But Daniel, what are some of the other threats that corals face beyond from climate?
Oh yeah, so corals have really faced multiple stresses for quite a long time now due to human development and anthropogenic changes to the planet. So we have ocean acidification, of course, along with climate change. So along with the warming waters, the oceans are becoming more acidic, the surface oceans where corals reside. And because corals are a calcifying organism, they build their shells and they build these reefs that accrete over time out of primarily calcium carbonate. There's other experts on the panel that could explain this better than me, but it becomes harder and harder for them to do so. And there's actually a paper in Science a few years ago from a colleague here at my university that shows around 2050 the reefs in the Great Barrier Reef will become net dissolving. So the ocean acidification will reach a point that the sediments and that structure that the corals have built up over time will start to become net dissolving. So that's just kind of how scary that is. But in terms of other stresses, nutrient pollution. So areas where there are coral reefs tend to be very nice places, and because of all of these benefits that coral reefs give us in fisheries and tourism and things, they tend to get developed. There tends to be nutrient pollution because of the coastal protection aspect. That land behind coral reefs tends to be very good for agriculture, and so there tends to be a lot of agriculture there. Fertilizers are added to the land, and so coral reefs evolved in a very oligotrophic ocean environment, and that just means very low nutrients. This is the kind of niche that coral reefs evolved to really take advantage of. They're incredible in how they can recycle and reuse the very limited resource of nutrients in those environments. As soon as there's a lot more, other life forms like sort of algae tend to take over. And so you often see a bleaching event. And because the nutrient background's been pushed up just a little bit, as long as the reef is undisturbed, it can persevere with that sort of nutrification. But once a bleaching event or another disturbance comes through, you sort of tip that balance a little bit, and the algae can kind of rush in and take over. And once that happens, you get an ecosystem shift, and it's very hard for the coral to reestablish. And then of course there's everything that humans are doing directly, from throwing boat anchors down onto the reef to, in some places of the world, they still fish with dynamite on coral reefs. So throwing dynamite in, and that blows up underwater and all the dead fish float to the surface. It's a very cheap, incredibly effective way of fishing, but you can imagine what it does to the coral reef below and the long-term sustainability.
Thanks. Oh, just a note to our audience. Please do not use the comment feature. Use the Q&A feature if you'd like to pose questions to us. Otherwise, it pops up and is a bit distracting for us here. Ken, we've heard a little bit about them, but could you elaborate on the main threats that climate change poses to coral reefs?
Well, first, just to point out that corals evolved under very uniform kind of conditions, both chemically and in terms of temperature. And so they're really tuned to live in a fairly narrow range. And, there are times in Earth history where corals were living in waters that were much warmer, but it took them, those temperature changes happened over millions of years. And so there was a chance to adapt. In contrast, there's never any evidence of corals living in waters where the chemistry wouldn't help them build their shells or skeletons. But the other thing I wanted to say about corals is that they're really unique systems, because in most ecosystems, the architecture of the ecosystem is provided by the floor of the seafloor or just the open ocean water, whereas corals, there's a narrow range of very sensitive organisms that are building the architecture of the ecosystem. And I saw there was a question that popped up about how long does it take them to come back. That corals became, there was no evidence of corals after the time when dinosaurs became extinct 66 million years ago. And it took hundreds of thousands of years for the corals to come back. And when they did come back, about half the species that were around living with the dinosaurs came back. And so what we're really looking at is the loss of reefs. Probably coral colonies will continue to survive as minor components of other ecosystems for a long time. But I didn't answer your question. I even forgot what your question was.
Oh, maybe actually I've got a follow-up question of my own just then. Maybe a distinction that would be helpful is you said you can have corals without the reefs. Can you just explain that a little? Because I think that might be a little
Yeah,
counterintuitive to
yeah. That
people.
if I don't know if you've ever been snorkeling, but sometimes you have like sort of grassy areas, and there's every once in a while a little coral colony in what's mostly a grassy or algal community. And I think this is probably what the future is like in a lot of places. That in order for coral reefs to exist, the rate at which they calcify has to be, or make their skeletons, has to be faster than the chemical and physical erosion of the reef. And so, what happens with all of these insults is that they can't keep up with the forces that are wearing them away, and then eventually the reefs disappear and usually take over by algal communities or something. So, but yeah. So and one of the questions I have about big, massive interventions like ocean alkalinity, which we'll come to, I'm sure, that my brother lives in Fiji near a coral reef, and the reef was killed just because they're growing sugar cane and sediment runs off the farms and swamps over the reefs. In other places, just the sewage water goes into the local coastal environment, and the nutrients allow the algae to go and kill off the reefs. And in Australia, they're dredging rivers so that the mines can operate, and then all this sediment from the dredges comes out over the reefs. And so, we're, there's a lot of, I mean, we have to stop the ocean acidification and the global warming, but there's a lot else we need to do to
Yeah.
help reefs.
Thanks. So coming to bleaching, I mean, a lot of these threats we were talking about are quite local in character, local runoff, local fisheries,
Mhm.
but the heating and the bleaching are global. So Cheryl, could you just give a bit more detail about coral bleaching and the marine heat waves that are connected to that?
So as I said previously, coral bleaching due to marine heat waves is rapidly becoming more widespread and at higher levels than we've ever seen. And that's true here in the US waters and across the globe. And we know from analysis of climate projections that marine heat waves are expected to increase in intensity, like how hot they are, duration, how long they are, and then the total of number of days per year. And the analysis is that by the end of the century, many regions would have near permanent marine heat waves without strong climate mitigation. Um, right. So how do we respond to that is the question next. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess what does it do to a coral first?
Oh,
So
what does
if
it do to
it's
a coral?
if it's too hot, what
If it's
happens to
too
our
hot, the corals, Daniel is much more of a coral ecologist than I am. But my understanding is that the corals, they kind of barf out their photosynthesizers when it gets too hot. And they bleach, so that's why they get white, and then they die because they need their symbiont to grow. Um, so yeah, they don't like it when it's hot. They die.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, I'll turn to Daniel. If you want to give us you can give us a slightly more detailed story, or is barfing out the photosynthesizers sufficient?
I wish I was a coral ecologist. Those guys have the life just scuba diving around on the reef all day long. Um, but yes, look, Cheryl's right. Essentially, when corals that get too hot, so a coral is both an animal and a plant, and that's one of the things that's so unique about them. And so it's an animal host, and within their cells, they maintain a special type of algae called a zooxanthellae, and the zooxanthellae are basically unicellular plants, and so they're performing photosynthesis like a tree, and the sugars that they produce is what provides the dominant food source for the coral, for the animal host. But what happens is when it becomes too hot, and the presence of light also plays a role in this, but fundamentally, when it becomes too hot, there's a stress response of bleaching, and this can also occur from other stress. If it becomes really too cold, corals can bleach too. It's essentially a stress response, but they're sort of algae can become toxic to them, and so they kick the algae out, and then essentially their algae gives them their color. That's why they turn white, and they start starving to death from that point on. Some corals are better than others at heterotrophic feeding. So feeding on like the animal can also sort of grab little bits of food out of the water mechanically. But Pretty much, they start starving to death, and depending on the level of stress and how long the bleaching event lasts, they can sometimes die or they can sometimes get repopulated by algae. But we're also seeing events now, like Cheryl mentioned earlier in the Florida Keys, where it's just so hot. The degree heating weeks are so extreme that it's not even that process that really of coral bleaching. The corals just get cooked to death. They just physiologically can't survive. So yeah, it's
And
a complicated process, but that's an overview.
it is a degree heating week. Is that kind of like an integral of how hot it is for how long? Is that kind of what that term means?
Exactly. So it's how hot it is above the normal maximum for that particular location. So it's quite interesting. Corals are very well adapted to where they live. So even the same species in different places have different heat tolerances. And so the sort of a good metric that we have is how hot does it get above the normal summertime maximum, and how long does it stay that hot? So you 2 degree heating weeks could be 2 degrees above that maximum for 1 week, or it could be 1 degree above for 2 weeks. But basically, it's the area under the curve, the total sort of heat stress.
Thanks. Kenneth, you want
What,
to get in?
yeah, one of the pathways that causes stress in the corals is under high light conditions and high temperature, the symbionts photosynthesize at a very rapid rate, and so then put a lot of oxygen into the cell. And so oxidative stress is one of the pathways. And people have done fish tank experiments where they add vitamin C to the fish tank water, and vitamin C acts as an antioxidant and it helps reduce the bleaching. So I don't know if that's another kind of geoengineering intervention, but at least in fish tanks, that helps a bit.
And we'll get to some of these interventions in a while, but let's talk a little more about or look ahead to the future, as Cheryl was doing earlier, to the fate of corals. I know, for example, Ken, in the past, corals are going extinct, functionally extinct several times. Do you think that's likely in the coming century? And
There's I mean, we wrote a paper or a couple of papers over a decade ago saying that by mid-century, if under current trajectories, that there'll be no sustainable reefs left in the world. Now, I think Daniel was alluding to this before, that, you can have a reef and it's tootling along, and, but maybe there's a hurricane or typhoon that hits it, or maybe there's some other series of bleaching events that come year after year. And then, algal, gets covered by algae, and then the corals can't come back. And so, yeah, so I think by mid-century, under current trajectories, most, if not all, of the reefs in the world will be in this state where if they suffer a big enough insult, the reef won't be able to reestablish itself.
yeah, okay. What direction do you have to? I know that it appeared in the Global Tipping Point report as the first tipping point that's crossed. What's your attitude?
Well, there's a coral reef database, and there's something like 13,000 reefs documented in that database. And if you say, um, I can't, I should do the math in my head, but if you say, okay, 50 years, 52 years, 13,000, that's 250 a year. So that means, like, well, maybe, my view is like, oh, there's probably 5 reefs a week becoming unsustainable. And then they're put into a state where they won't be able to recover from a major insult. And so I don't, in aggregate, maybe it's a tipping point, but I think and also, if you look at a reef, like, each colony has its own, when does this coral colony die and when does this coral
Yeah.
polyp die? So I think there's a whole bunch of spatial scales.
So
But I
it's
mean,
not
the overall
it's
look
not
is
one big
dismal.
system. It's lots of little
Yeah,
systems
it's
that
not
are
like
being
that all
tipped.
reefs go out in one afternoon because we've gone
Yeah.
over this tipping point. And also, even when they're unsustainable, some of them might hang on for, many decades just because they're lucky enough not to suffer a major insult.
Well, I'm about to turn to questions, but if Daniel or Cheryl has a slightly more optimistic view of corals prospects, please let us know.
I, I don't know if it's more optimistic, but talking to coral ecologists, the response is to work to find individuals that have been resistant to bleaching and breed them and plant them, and also make genetic banks so that hopefully we will get it together, do mitigation, Ken's like, no, it's not gonna
Yeah,
happen. But
no,
so working to like how trying everything we can to keep the corals from going extinct. So animal husbandry, if you will.
We'll talk more
yeah,
about
the
that later.
near term.
Sorry, Ken. Daniel, any
No.
last word before you go to Q&A for a second?
Sure. I'd just say yeah, look, I mean, Ken's talked quite a lot about this, but there's also one thing that hasn't come up is there's both coral refugia, so there's places that are not feeling the full impact of climate change, deeper waters, certain places where the oceanography just plays really favorably for the corals, and as Ken's mentioned a few times as well, and Cheryl now, there's genetic diversity as well as there's some corals living in some really extremely harsh environments. Dr. Emma Camp in Australia studies this a lot, sort of up in lagoons and things where it's super hot, it's extremely fresh water and salt water. So I think we do need to separate a little bit what we're talking about, the sort of the large scale coral reefs, which are very much in a state of collapse, but corals themselves are quite a amazing and versatile organism, and are likely to persist, for a very long time, I think, in
Excellent.
some form. But yeah.
I'll turn over to Dave now for some questions from the audience. Reminding you all, if you put your question in the Q&A section, we'll try and get to it. We'll focus a bit more on the background on corals now, and the second half will go to interventions. So off to you, Dave.
Thank you, Pete. Yes. So yeah, we've had a few questions come in on sort of the magnitude of threat. So I wanted to start here with basically a question on whether it's the heating or ocean acidification that are sort of more responsible for the major threat, or is there a way to sort of compare those two threats? So I guess maybe start with you, Cheryl. Do you want to take that?
So right now, it's temperature. What it will be in the future depends a lot on how corals respond to acidification. And from my knowledge, we're still trying to figure that out, that the co-stressors of light and temperature and acidification, how corals respond to that over time, is something we're still teasing out. And a lot of thinking about that has been very extreme, like end of the century, but we really need to be looking at the next 20, 30 years to get through the mid-century.
Great. Another one we have here. So actually, I think this was touched on briefly right at the end there, but Gregory Slater asks about engineering more robust corals. So I know you were talking a little bit about that already, but that is an interesting topic. So do we have more information about sort of, the potential for actually engineering more resilient corals? I guess, Daniel, do you want to try that one?
Sure, it's a little outside my area of expertise, but certainly in the Australian Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program I'm a part of, there's quite a large concentration of scientists working on this question. So we know there's a huge variability in the genetics of coral and in their ability to withstand different extremes and different temperatures. And so the effort there is sort of looking at things like selective breeding. Can we take the strongest corals and breed them together and then get an even stronger coral? And can we do that over generations? And so essentially this is kind of trying to accelerate what we think would be the natural selection process, so the natural genetic adaptation of corals over time. And if we can kind of do that, accelerate that, and mass plant corals back out on the reef, the hope is that as the sort of don't know if this is a good word, but the weaker corals die off over time, we might be able to sort of help the stronger corals to dominate and sort of assist the reefs to persist in that way.
Great, thank you. Another question that has come in here is about economic impacts. We were talking sort of toward the top about what it means to lose, coral reefs, what that means in terms of its cultural impact and its economic impact. So I guess, do any of you have more thoughts on sort of the potential economic impacts if some of these maybe worst case scenarios or the trajectories that we're on really come to pass? I guess, Cheryl, can I go back to you for that one real quick?
Yeah. Yes. So there's been a lot of good work on this in terms of the ecosystem services that coral reefs provide. As Daniel was saying, they're very culturally important, but they also have really big importance in, getting fish for aquariums and blocking storm surges, aquaculture, and a lot of recreational fisheries and snorkeling, right? Like, so you're not going to go to a place where the main thing you do on vacation is go snorkel if there's nothing to see. And so there's a number of impacts to these like economic measures beyond just the biodiversity and wanting to preserve these beautiful, amazing aquatic forests that are really important for us. And so in a lot of communities locally, I'm thinking like here in the Yucatan, the Mayan coast, depend on that money for tourism, and it's really important to their economies. So that the losing that, if that's your main driver of your local economy, is huge. Or if that's your main food source, are fish that are reliant on the coral reefs, what is your community going to do for food security and economics then?
Great, thank you. So I think a lot of the questions that have been coming in are more on the climate intervention side. So Pete, maybe it makes the most sense to just go straight into the second half of the discussion, and then we can get to some of these other questions a little later on.
Perfect. Okay, so before we go back, I just wanted to pose something to our audience. Given this threat we're seeing to corals, there's growing interest in these interventions, which we're about to discuss in more depth. So what does our audience think about them? Let's put a poll up. So, given the threat to corals, are novel interventions, currently undefined, justified? No, unsure, yes locally, or yes globally? Maybe a little hard to answer before we know what we're talking about, but do have a go, and we can get into the ideas and their upsides and downsides shortly. Mhm. No, more support for local interventions than global ones, which cues up my question for Daniel. So, Daniel, you're involved with an Australian effort that you mentioned briefly, exploring a number of possible local interventions over the Great Barrier Reef. Could you introduce that effort and explain a bit about the range of interventions that are covered in that?
Sure. So I mentioned it very briefly before. The Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program, RAP, was established by the Australian government in 2020 to, it's essentially become, I think, the world's largest effort dedicated to sort of research and development to help an ecosystem survive climate change. I'll have to pick and choose some of the things that RAP is looking into. It's been a very structured process. So there was a initial phase where a very wide net was cast to collect up essentially all of the ideas from any source that we could find, including the public, including the scientists, every idea that we could think of, a long list of ideas, which was from memory about 148 ideas that might be able to help coral reefs. And we went through a sort of a risk and potential benefits type process. And scalability was really a key determinant. We were looking for things that were scalable to make a difference at an ecosystem scale rather than just a very, very local scale. And so we whittled that down to 43 or so ideas that we deemed were worthy of further research and development. With the resources and the funding available, we then had to prioritize those. So I'll just talk about some of the main focuses of the program. So there's the cooling and shading sub-program that I lead, and that's focused on engineering type interventions to essentially try to relieve some of that heat or light stress that corals are experiencing in the first place. And so this includes things like marine cloud brightening, which I'm sure we'll talk more about to try and brighten clouds to shade the corals, creating artificial sea fogs. So you take seawater and atomize it to make a low-hanging sea fog, and that can shade corals during the doldrum periods when they experience the most stress. A fairly local intervention, that one, but relevant to sort of high-value sites. And then other engineering ideas like trying to pump up cold water, or there's some other sort of shading ideas, but I won't dwell on those just for time. Then we have our sort of big pillar of the coral-centric interventions, we tend to call them. And so these are what we talked about a little bit before, like developing technologies and methods to try and enhance the thermal tolerance of coral, and then alongside sort of mass aquaculture, like kind of factory style automated robots growing, millions and millions of corals, and then automated systems to go and plant those out onto reefs. So that kind of coral gardening has been done at a very local scale for decades now. Including some sort of efforts to selectively breed and enhance thermal tolerance, but this is really sort of trying to take that and industrialize it to get the throughput of millions and millions of corals per year. And then some of the other interventions include things like stabilizing rubble. So after a disturbance, a cyclone comes through, the rubble, the sort of reef gets turned to rubble, and it can take like a decade or more for that rubble to sort of settle and accrete again to become a stable enough surface for the coral reef to really regrow. So there's efforts to sort of look into, could you speed that process up? There's quite a few more, but I don't want to take up too much time. So it gives a sense of it.
And could you give us a sense of the scale of this operation? Because there's quite a lot of money going into this, and it's not just a research effort, right?
So the first phase, which is just coming to an end now, the first sort of 5-year block of R&D, was primarily a research effort. I mean, it grew at its peak to have around 300 scientists involved. So it has been a very large concerted effort, and we really looked at a lot of things in parallel, because all of these interventions or possible interventions have to get evaluated, not just for efficacy, how well they might work, but for potential benefits, potential risks, scalability, cost, as well as actually sort of developing the technology to do them. So it has been a very large effort. There are some aspects of RAP now that are starting to move more from a research phase into a sort of a pilot deployment phase, we call it, and that's really starting to test out and put into practice some of those mass aquaculture methods and planting corals out on the reef. The artificial sea fogging is another idea that's probably getting close enough to now go and start actually sort of practicing it in anger during bleaching events. So yeah, that's sort of where we're up to. So it was originally envisioned as a 10-year program. We've had the funding for the first 5 years, and we're now coming to the end of that and sort of lobbying the Australian government for the next 5-year block.
Great, thanks. We'll come back to marine collaborating a little later, but I want to turn to Ken. Something we've not really talked too much about yet is potential interventions to address ocean acidification, which is something you've studied quite a lot. Can you just explain, is it possible to intervene to address ocean acidification, and how might we go about doing that?
Yeah, the CO2, when it dissolves into seawater, becomes a weak acid, carbonic acid, and this carbonic acid tends to chemically erode the skeletons of corals. And we did an experiment now about a decade ago where we put effectively an antacid into seawater and let it flow across the reef. And we measured, that the reef grew its skeletons faster. And really what we think happened is that the rate of the reef growth is a balance between it's producing its skeleton and it's chemically eroding. And so what we really think it did is slowed the chemical erosion of the reef primarily. But, it was a huge effort to do this for a number of hours over a series of weeks at the scale of, one bit of reef flat. And to even do it at the scale of an entire island, or, one of the problems is the water flowing through the Great Barrier Reef. I forget the exact residence time of the water, but, it's only in that reef for a couple of weeks, I think. And so you would have to constantly be adding antacid at huge volumes. And so I think it's the kind of thing that could make sense. Let's say you had a semi-enclosed bay and you want to make a marine preserve. And the idea that you would maybe control the chemistry of one bay, that seems feasible to me. But unless it's sort of people have also suggested alkalinity addition or antacid addition as a CO2 carbon dioxide removal approach. And so if that were done at scale, you could blend the two systems. But I think just to do it at the scale of the reef, my feeling is that nobody's going to pay for it for a long enough time.
So Cheryl, we're going to go to solar geoengineering in a moment, but we've talked about quite a few possible interventions on the reef. Are there do these have some downsides to them? I mean, are there some risks to intervening in the reefs in the way we've been discussing, the planting of different variants of the coral species, the, interventions in the structure of the reef?
I'm not enough of a coral ecologist. That's not what I thought you were going to ask me, Pete. I thought you were going to ask me about the issues with interventions in general. So let me answer the question I thought you were going to ask me, because I prepared
Sure.
for that one. And maybe Daniel can talk more about the biology, because he's much better positioned for that. For any kind of intervention, and this is true for local interventions as well, governance and if we can agree on what to do, and if that lack of agreement will create more conflict. And this is the biggest issue with solar geoengineering, but it's also an issue with ecosystem manipulation in general. People are very uncomfortable with this, and for good reason. So Thomas Oliver has done some research saying it's like we're afraid of nuclear war. It's this technocratic intervention that people don't trust government scientists to do these things. And I will note that it's 85 seconds to midnight on the doomsday clock, which means we're closer to nuclear war than we've ever been. And these types of conflicts we could have over these interventions could just trigger more conflict and lead to worse outcomes. So we're not good at cooperating. I think that's the main thing. How do we cooperate on mitigation? How do we cooperate on intervention? And I think that's the biggest problem we have.
Yeah. So the physical things we might be worried about here, the physical effects of these interventions perhaps matter a lot less, or we should worry about them a lot less than the socio-political things. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if we can get greenhouse gas emissions down, all of this is moot, right? If we can agree on that and get that sorted, we're done. Mostly. Like, we'll have some repair, but we won't have it getting worse.
Yeah. Well, Daniel, you've been leading that cooling and shading theme you were mentioning in the Great Barrier Reef. I think we've got a slide we might put up about marine cloud brightening. But yeah, could you just explain what marine cloud brightening is and how you're thinking about potentially applying it over the reef?
Sure. So I guess the marine cloud, out of all the ideas within the cooling and shading program, but also I suppose across the whole of our app, of the marine cloud brightening is one that's become, I guess flagship's maybe the wrong word, but one of the more focused on ideas, and it's inherently because of its scalability. As we've sifted through these ideas, scalability comes up again and again and again as the biggest challenge. The Great Barrier Reef is enormous. It's roughly the size of Italy. It's made up of 3,000 or so individual reefs that stretch 2,500 kilometres along the coast of Australia. And so marine cloud brightening actually is, applying it for the reef is actually a scaled down idea, because the concept was originally conceived to try to brighten clouds to cool down the whole planet in response to climate change. And so even though the Great Barrier Reef is enormous, it's something like 0.07% of the Earth's surface. So it's actually a incredibly scaled down, and that's even if you did it at the entire Great Barrier Reef scale. We've recently done some research, and we think you could do it even at much smaller scales than that. But the basic idea is that clouds, especially out over the more remote oceans, are sensitive to the number of particles floating around in the air, because each droplet in a cloud fundamentally needs a particle in the air for that water vapor to condense to make a cloud droplet. And so the clouds will form regardless outside of very extreme conditions. But what happens is you have the same cloud, but it's forced to make large droplets because there's only a few particles around, which is what we call cloud condensation nuclei. However, when you add more cloud condensation nuclei, you get the same cloud, the same amount of water vapor is there, but it's now made up the cloud of a lot of smaller droplets, and these are much more effective at reflecting sunlight back into space. And so this might sound like crazy out there science, but one of the key reasons we know this works is we can already observe it in the environment. Very few people are probably aware of this, but at the same time that we've been releasing all of these greenhouse gases and warming the planet up, all of the extra particles that humankind are putting into the atmosphere have been brightening the clouds and cooling the planet down in opposition. So the estimates is quite a lot of uncertainty, but something like a third of global warming has been offset or masked by this inadvertent, unintentional marine cloud brightening that we've been doing since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And so the idea is that you could do this in a more natural way by replicating the natural process of over the remote oceans. A lot of the cloud condensation nuclei come from tiny droplets of salt, which come from tiny particles of salt, which come from tiny droplets of seawater whipped off the surface of the ocean by wind. And so in this intentional process, we take seawater and we atomize it into tiny, tiny droplets of water. So one shot glass of water can produce about 1,000 trillion droplets. So it's really quite incredible. These are essentially nano-sized, and they evaporate. The salt crystals float up into the clouds, and we've now been able to measure that you can actually brighten the clouds this way.
Fantastic. Well, I'm just going to go to the next big idea we'll talk about, and I'll go to Cheryl with a question in a minute, but stratospheric aerosol injection. This is another idea to get up into the upper atmosphere and to release tiny particles, in this case, to directly reflect light rather than to affect the properties of clouds. And being so high in the atmosphere, the particles last a lot longer and you get a lot of bang for your buck. Now, Cheryl, you've got a preprint of a publication currently under review, so not rock solid yet, but this is looking at the impacts of climate change and this stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI idea, and how it might affect corals. I think we've got one of your figures here that we can flash up. Maybe you could talk us through it when it pops
Sure.
up. There we
Yeah.
are.
Oh, you made a new one out of our data. So this is work that's being led by my PhD student, Gowri Anil, who's doing an outstanding job with this. Let me make it a little bigger. I haven't seen this version yet. This is nice. So what we're looking at here are projections of coral reef bleaching using Earth system models, so climate model simulations, with and without stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI. And so on the left figure are trajectories of a moderate warming scenario, SSP2 4.5, kind of middle of the road. And then that's in orange. And then in the blue, it's with stratospheric aerosol injection, designed to keep global surface temperatures at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And so the question is, our research question here is like, do we need SAI to save coral reefs? And the different colors in the right panels are NOAA Coral Reef Watch's alerts. And I will mention that they added 2 new levels after the 2023 coral bleaching event in the Florida Keys, which are the risk of severe multi-species mortality and near complete mortality. And so as we go from 2035 to 2069, with and without the stratospheric aerosol injection, we can see that up to 50%, and this is over an ensemble, so there's a bunch of simulations. We're accounting for internal climate variability, and we're looking at all the reefs globally. So this is a global average study looking at degree heating weights as a metric for bleaching. And so if you look at that orange, like middle color, the risk of multi-species mortality, it's 50% of the world's tropical coral, warm water coral reefs will experience mortality by 2069. And 25% is severe multi-species mortality. So we're looking at a lot more of these extinction events. And I should say, this is an average across multiple models. So like individual events would be even more severe than this. And on the right, we can see that with SAI, and I think that the color is wrong for one of them, that we don't
Oh,
have
I
any of
see. Yes.
the white. I think that something happened there. That we can reduce those darker or the risk of multi-species mortality and the risk of severe multi-species mortality are gone in this scenario with SAI. And so then the question is, we're terrified to do this because we can't agree on emissions control. Can we actually agree to send airplanes up into the stratosphere and dump sulfate aerosols up there without starting World War III? But it would save the coral reefs. So.
Well, and just to clarify, you said on the left-hand plot, you'd see 50% of corals seeing that severe multi-species mortality. Is that
Mhm.
every single year?
Not the severe, the risk of multi-species mortality. So
Yes.
the middle
Yes.
one, the middle orange.
Is that is that a 50% per year and possibly a different 50% each year?
It,
Or is
it's
it sort of a
50% by
total?
air. It's 50% by area. So it's 50% of all the reefs would have like a potentially functional extinction maybe level or severe bleaching event. Is that by year? That's a good
So,
question. I wish we
so
had
is that
Gowrie
2020,
available to answer
2099?
that for you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I just
Yeah,
say
no, that's a great
2099 and
question, and
2020.
she would be able to answer that. So,
Okay.
um,
Well,
we're working on revisions right now. We got excellent reviews. Thank you, reviewers, and I mean, we got very constructive reviews. So please look for, and you can read the preprint, and feel free to email us
we
with
will
questions.
we will include a link there, and we've also got some peer review of our own there, so we need to change that figure and update it. So, Kenneth, you want to jump in?
Yeah, it's if we look back at warm periods in Earth history, there were times like in the Eocene when the 50 some odd million years ago when the Earth was much warmer than today, and corals were doing just fine in the tropics. And so this suggests that these kind of breeding programs that Daniel spoke about to help corals live in warmer waters are at least feasible. Like maybe it's too fast for natural processes to get them there, but they've done it in the past. In contrast, and also Cheryl mentioned that right now temperature is the main threat to corals. But I would just like to point out that under sort of current emission trajectories, the waters, the corals that throughout Earth history have never been able to build reefs where the chemical conditions were not conducive to maintaining reefs. And so, it is true that the short-term challenge is temperature, and that solar geoengineering of various sort of flavors could help with that. But the long-term prospects of the reefs are dim unless we really do something about the chemical conditions in the ocean, which ideally would be achieved by reducing and even reversing
Yeah.
greenhouse gas emissions.
Thanks, Ken. All right, so we've run a little over on my script here. So, Daniel, any last words before we go back to the Q&A?
Oh wow. Um, yeah, we ran quick at the end, didn't we? Because I wonder if we've really given the audience a good sense of these different techniques of marine cloud brightening. And so I guess the marine cloud brightening intervention for the Great Barrier Reef that we're considering is very intermittent. So during or when there's a marine heat wave occurring, it's a very localized manipulation of the cloud, short-lived. You showed the slide that shows these extra sea salt crystals only last in the atmosphere for a day or two. So you could stop doing it. Everything goes back to normal very quick. And so you'd be doing this, in a very regional way, intermittently in response to a marine heat wave. The stratospheric aerosol injection is a global intervention. You're putting particles in the stratosphere to cool down the whole planet, and they last up there for several years. And so there's vast differences in both the potential benefits, obviously doing this, doing the cloud brightening intermittently over the Great Barrier Reef, isn't going to have the same level of benefits as cooling down the whole planet, but also the risks of the two different types of interventions are vastly different. And so obviously we don't have a lot of time left to get into the detail of all of that, but I'd encourage the audience to go and do some research themselves. And SRM 360 is a great source for information.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So Q&A, I guess I'll hand back over to Dave, and we'll get a few more before we close out.
Great. Yes. So there have been a few questions sort of about some of the logistics of these interventions. One that was sent in ahead of time from Sean Griggs was about sort of the details of a marine cloud brightening program over the Great Barrier Reef. Sort of things like how many boats would be needed if we were going to cover the entire reef? What would it cost? How does that sort of compare with the current funds that are allocated for protection of the reef? So just sort of the logistical look at that. Daniel, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. It's something that we're really concentrating much more in the future phase of the project. The first phase was very much focused on the foundational science. Could you even do this? Would it even work? Is the theory correct? But we have done a bit of work on it. And what we're looking at, I think, because of that consideration is that we're starting to focus in on a scenario where you sort of protected 10 or 13% of the Great Barrier Reef, which is a very high value tourism region. It's the tourism is fairly concentrated on the Great Barrier Reef. And so our latest estimates are that might take, if you were to use vessels, we're looking at lots of different ways, but if you were to use sort of mobile vessels, it might take 20 or 25. Using technology that doesn't yet exist, which is an important point. We're not, we've developed the technology to a point to allow us to start to answer those fundamental science questions, but it's a long, long way and probably totally different technology that you would need to go and actually implement this. And cost, well, so the Great Barrier Reef brings in about 7 billion a year to the Australian economy. I think, I don't really know the total amount that's spent on its management but I think, order of 100 million a year is maybe a reasonable estimate. To do this area of the Great Barrier Reef with 25 boats, look, we haven't really done the numbers carefully, but we did do a number for the entire GBR very early on in the program with very rough numbers. But you might be looking at something comparable, 50 or 100 million a year. It certainly wouldn't be cheap operating vessels, and it's, yeah, I mean, we don't have good numbers because it depends as well, like how you do it and are those vessels doing other things for the rest of the year, or do you have to own them and then 3/4 of the year they're not doing anything because it's not hot on the reef? So there's a lot of intricacies, but maybe that gives us a sense of it.
Great, thank you. So maybe one more quick question before we sort of close, and then maybe we can stick around for a bit if people have some time. From Arthur Dahl, one question about stratospheric aerosol injection. If it must be sort of continually renewed, this is relating to the idea of termination shock, I guess. If anything stops it, with the sudden return to the pre-SAI temperatures, how would that affect the corals, I guess, is the question here. So Cheryl, do you want to address that given your paper?
Yeah. So again, we have to cooperate to do SAI. And if you stop, there's been a number of papers about this, bad things would happen because you would have it get really hot really fast and nothing's adapted for that kind of change. So yeah, it's a big issue. I mean, Pete could say more about this. He's written much more about that than I have.
I think at that point, what I'll do is jump in. We're reaching the end of the hour. As Dave said, we'll formally close on the hour, but if some of the panelists would be willing to hang on a couple more minutes afterwards just to wrap up some of the questions. But just to say to the audience again, thank you so much for joining us. We really, really do appreciate it. You can find our Corals Primer, which is a kind of a quick overview of the various issues facing corals and various interventions on the website. You can also find a whole bunch of other really useful kind of introductory materials, graphics, and so forth. And there's also a function in there to ask a question. So please, if you have any specific questions, ask us and we'll do our best either to answer you or to put you in touch with the a relevant expert or organization. So again, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And thank you so much to all the panelists. And with that, I guess we sort of formally close, but we're going to hang around for maybe 5-10 minutes more to take on a couple of more questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mark. So yeah, we do have some other questions we can get to here if the panelists have a few minutes. Let's see. One question here, I guess this is going back to some of the modeling that Cheryl, you were talking about, from Lloyd Whitman. He's asking about the assumptions that the models include about emissions, given that we do remove particulates from the atmosphere if emissions go down. So how do we sort of account for cooling from the fossil fuel emissions that we then, if we project into the future with SAI or without, how does that sort of play in, I guess?
Yeah, so the future scenario, it does not include that at all. So that we're using the standard CMIP6 SSP2 shared socioeconomic pathway to 4.5. So that's fixed, and those emissions are fixed. That's how CMIP6 worked. And then the stratospheric aerosols imposed on top of that. So there isn't any feedback. For CMIP7, we're going to have interactive emissions. So that'll be interesting, and we can start to ask those kinds of questions.
They may have asked a slightly different question there, if I heard correctly. Is it about the aerosol pollution? Air pollution has had a cooling effect, and in the future, as we clean up the air, that cooling effect from air pollution will fall. What impact would that have?
Well, we're already seeing that. We've seen because of ship emissions. So ship tracks are a natural form of marine cloud brightening. I believe Daniel has a paper about this. And we've seen a global cooling signal from the reduced emissions. And so people are scrambling trying to model that effectively. And clouds are very difficult. They're these micro scale processes that we have to parameterize. So that's a very difficult thing to simulate, and it's always a challenge in our system models.
We did a little calculation some years ago that, like, if you have a kind of a typical coal plant, which is not very clean with a lot of scrubbers, that I think it takes like after 7 years or so, the CO2 warming is starting to overwhelm the aerosol-induced cooling. And so, if so if we turned off all coal plants now, you might see a kick up in warming due to the aerosol reduction, but probably by a decade later, the subsequent decade, things would be cooler because of the loss of greenhouse gas emissions.
Great. We had another question here, just going back to sort of the resilience of corals, actually, that might be an interesting one to cover. This is from Arthur Dahl. Could healthy coral reefs, such as those that build atolls, keep up with sea level rise? Basically, can they sort of build fast enough to what we expect the future sea level rise to be? Ken, do you want to address that one maybe?
I'm not super expert on it, but sea level rose, at the end of the last glacial, at the end of the ice ages, and while there were reefs that got drowned, many reefs kept up. So maybe Daniel knows more about this, but the sea level is 120 meters higher than it was 20,000 years ago, and the reefs are, so they tend. Yeah, I mean, I think the sea level, if you say it's a meter a century, which is what people are thinking about now, that's a centimeter per year, and a centimeter per year might be something that a reef could keep up with. In future centuries, the mean sea level rise is expected to go up to 2 or 3 meters a year. It might be tougher for things to keep up.
I'd just add that I think I'm not an expert at all on this either, but I suspect a healthy coral reef ecosystem probably has a pretty good chance. But I think I guess it's these kind of combined stresses, and with such degraded coral reef ecosystems, they're probably less likely.
Great, thank you. Another one that was sent in ahead of time from Annalot Brewers. She's basically curious if some of the testing that's been going on at the Great Barrier Reef is sort of exportable. Are the things that have been learned and are still being learned, going to be useful for, the Florida Keys or for reefs in other parts of the world, or are there important differences in terms of, the things that have been learned so far in that program? So Daniel, do you want to touch on that?
Sure. It's a real mixed bag. Some of what we've learned over the last 5 years is directly applicable to any sort of marine cloud brightening effort anywhere. Some is not. If you were to try and cool the whole planet, you'd target these sort of marine stratocumulus cloud decks over cooler waters. And the microphysics and even in the boundary layer dynamics, the larger scale dynamics are really quite different in those cloud systems. So some lessons wouldn't transfer. In terms of the major difference with coral reefs, though, is that the Great Barrier Reef is quite a special case. So I haven't gone and looked at where else this might be applicable in the same way, but in the Great Barrier Reef, Ken mentioned very early on the residence time of the water. It's essentially a huge lagoon and it's quite shallow. And so the average depth of the Great Barrier Reef is only about 40 meters or so, and we're talking about an area hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. So it's a huge shallow lagoon, and you can think of it a little like a pond of water on the beach on a hot day. It warms up very very easily. It also cools down very very easily because there's less total mass of water there to absorb the energy. So when we run our scenarios of doing cloud brightening over the reef, it takes those few weeks, it sort of depends where you are, but say between 3 and 6 weeks for the water to sort of cool down and then stabilize. And so that's sort of representative of the residence time of that water. So on that sort of scale of time, new water's coming in and old water's moving out. So if you go to a different reef system somewhere else, it might not have the same oceanography. If the water's just flowing past, then essentially you're trying to cool that water down every single day instead of slowly over 5 or 6 weeks. And on top of that, I guess you also need clouds that are conducive. We don't have the very best clouds over the Great Barrier Reef by a long shot, but you need them to be sensitive to aerosol perturbation and sensitive enough that it can make a difference to the coral. That's really the key question that we're working on, I'd say, over the Great Barrier Reef. It looks positive, but there's still a lot of uncertainty there. And finally, you need the background aerosol conditions to be low. There's not much point doing marine cloud brightening if there's already plenty of particles in the air. And it just so happens that the trade winds during summer, when we get coral bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef, are predominantly sourced with air from out over the South Pacific, which is extremely low in background concentrations of these cloud condensation nuclei. So you do need those three factors to kind of line up for this to work. And so I suspect there's not too many places where that occurs.
Excellent.
You know,
Well,
I know
thanks
that,
to the audience for lots of great questions. I just want to turn to the panelists for some final thoughts. I hear you
yeah,
want to
because I
get
know
in, Ken,
Cheryl had
so
some things she wanted to say.
well, I'll pass on to Cheryl then. Cheryl, what are your final
Yeah,
thoughts?
so two things. Thank you, Carrie, for putting we just had a review article come out in Reviews of Geophysics on the potential impacts of climate intervention on marine ecosystems, and that includes both solar radiation modification and marine carbon dioxide removal. In that, we have some analysis about corals and aragonite saturation. So aragonite saturation is a measure of ocean acidification that's important for organisms that make their bodies out of aragonite, which is a type of mineral. It gets worse under SAI because of a cooling effect. And so that, if we do SAI without reducing greenhouse gases, there could be problems from that enhanced acidification. And then the second thing is when we're thinking about MCB, a property of the atmosphere is it has teleconnection, so that it's like the butterfly effect. When you perturb something in one place, it can do something across the globe. And so one of the big questions, and this has been shown to work sometimes, but maybe not other times, is if you cool a local area, is that going to screw up the weather somewhere else? And that could again lead to these governance issues of people blaming. We wouldn't want Daniel to do MCB in Australia and have India blame him for the monsoon failing and start a war. Like, we don't want that to happen. So we need to think about these localized cooling and how it might impact other communities.
Yeah, great. Well, any final thoughts, Ken, Daniel, before we close out?
I'll let Ken go
Please.
first.
Yeah, just to say that I've spent a bunch of years working on solar geoengineering and a bunch of years looking at coral response to alkalinity addition. And these days I'm spending more of my time working on emissions reduction, and I don't think energy system transition will really happen fast enough to necessarily save the coral reefs. But every carbon dioxide emission is another increment of damage, and the more we can avoid, the better off we are, and better off the coral reefs are. And so, while I'm all for these intervention techniques if they can help protect the environment, ultimately it's got to be about energy system transition.
Great. Thanks.
I couldn't agree with Ken more. I think I'll try not to get too into that, but certainly our modelling shows that there's almost no point doing marine cloud brightening over the Great Barrier Reef if you're not also aggressively tackling emissions at the same time. It can't do anything better than maybe buy us a couple of extra decades of time. That's the best case scenario if it works as well as we hope it possibly could. So it's absolutely not one or the other, and I think we've heard a whole bunch of reasons why it's exactly the same situation with SAI. I don't think anybody that's a serious scientist investigating any of these interventions would tell you any differently. Nobody thinks that this is a cure for the problem, but maybe a very uncomfortable something that we should consider if we're going to have to make a choice between two bad outcomes. And I would say that we're doing abysmally at reducing emissions. In fact, they're still increasing. The amount of coal-fired power in the world is still increasing. We've got a lot of work to do there. So I'm glad Ken's working on that. But I guess I'd just say that I think, especially for any younger generations that are watching this panel, these questions, because of that, because we're not doing a good job on emission, they're just going to become more and more prominent. So the more informed people can become about these issues, then the more we can collectively make responsible choices about how we should be going forward. So I'd just encourage that. Thanks, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, thanks to all our panelists, Ken Caldeira, Cheryl Harrison, and Daniel Harrison, no relation, I presume. And thanks to our audience for joining us. Okay, thank you. And bye.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Pete.
Thank you.